So we think TJ Hawkinson's going to get extended, right? But what would that extension look like? Let's go deep on TJ Hawkinson and his potential contract on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. The show is on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. You can also find the show on Amazon Fire or Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. It's TJ Hockenson Day here on the Locked On Vikings podcast. It seems likely Darren Wilson of KSTP on his show, I think on his Score North show, said that he thinks it's really likely that TJ Hockenson gets extended. Now, Darren Wolfson will speculate more than most beat journalists will. Like, most of them will they'll only say something when it's like being reported and it's happening. But Darren Wolfson likes to play a little fast and loose. And I love that about him. I think it's great to hear somebody who's a little bit more plugged in say, it seems like this is the way the wind is blowing, but I'm not sure yet, and be a little more transparent. So that's not saying that there's anything material yet necessarily, but it makes a lot of sense anyways. TJ Hockenson had a very good year, or half a year, I guess, with the Vikings. They traded a second and a fourth next year. By the way, speaking of player trades, I don't think I've mentioned it on the show yet, but in case you missed it, Jalen Reagor, the other player trade the Vikings made it on the kind of eve of the season. That was a fourth and a seventh if he hit a certain condition, but he did not hit that condition. It turned out it was like receiving production stuff. He didn't get close to it. So that's actually a fifth next year, a fifth in 2024 and a seventh this year in 2023. And with the rule of thumb with draft picks is if you're deferring them a year, the way to value it is to like pretend it's down, or like a fifth next year is worth a sixth this year. You just put it down around. So you could think of it as, would you trade a sixth and a seventh for Jalen Reagor? Yes or no? That should be your opinion on the thing, to be basically a punt returner. I don't know. Seems fine to me, but I digress. To recap with the Hockenson trade, if you take all of the compensation that the Vikings gave, which amounts to, this could have been a little worse if the Vikings won that Giants playoff game, which TJ Hockenson himself was doing quite a bit to try and enable, but alas, they did not get there. But the Vikings gave up a second rounder this year, and they get a fourth rounder back from the Lions. So a second became a fourth, and then next year, a third will become a fourth, and that third would have become a fifth if they won the playoff game, but they did not, so it becomes a fourth. If you add all that up and you throw it on like the Rich Hill chart, and you do the thing where you downgrade the next year picks around each, I'll do all that arithmetic real quick, and it adds up to, call it pick like 60, late second rounder kind of value that they gave up for TJ Hockenson. So a late second rounder for TJ Hockenson. So if they still had their second rounder and you had the option to just have TJ Hockenson for it instead of, I don't know, whatever random center you would have drafted there or whatever, do you think that that would be a good idea with 1 year left on his contract and you need to extend him? I'm pretty happy with that. I don't know about you, but the way that Hockenson played, especially in the two Lions games, in the Washington game when he first got here, was really admirable for a guy who had just gotten here. And you could see some of the mental mistakes that happened from being new to the scheme. And of course, they dried up a lot after the first couple games. It was really front-loaded with those problems. Had some drops, and that was frustrating. But consistently got separation, consistently enough for a tight end, was able to block. Obviously, you end up on defensive ends a lot. You won't win all of those. Really versatile, and I mean, made the Pro Bowl, and nobody can really argue with that. And that says, I think, a little bit more about the state of the position in the NFC than it does about like the Pro Bowl or whatever. But He is like, you take Kittle away, and who in the NFC would you rather have? Like Dallas Goedert, I guess. Sure, maybe, but I don't know why I'd bother. I'm really happy with DJ Hockenson. I'm really glad he's here, and I'm excited to keep him in Minnesota for the foreseeable future. So, uh, going off of Doogie's report that, hey, they really want to extend him, let's take a look at what that would be. And I want to really go deep. I haven't gotten a chance to really do that with any of these contracts. I've kind of done a proposed contract structure, but I want to take you through the thought process of all the different contract triggers and options and sort of levers and weird little tricks you can put in a contract. And we can sort of use this not necessarily as a salient prediction. I'll do my best, but more as a sort of landscape to explore. And let's explore how NFL contracts, and in particular, Rob Brzezinski Viking contracts, tend to play out. But the first question is, what do you want? How long do you want TJ Hockenson to remain a Viking? Let's forget the money for a while, but let's, on making a decent amount of money, how long do you want TJ Hockenson to be here? He'll be 26 years old for the 2023 season, so it's not like he's getting long in the tooth or anything. Do you want him to be here through his age 30 season and his age 31 season? I'll go with a 5-year. That's what the tight ends have been getting nowadays is, 5-year deals, or I think it was like 4 years and 2 void years with Dallas Goedert and in Philadelphia or something like that. I'll go with a 5-year deal here, and I'm actually going to pull up Over the Cap's contract constructor tool, which is a nice little tool that can you can kind of use to learn how everything gets accounted with the salary cap and how things change. And let's draft up a contract offer that we would give to TJ Hockenson if we were the Minnesota Vikings trying to begin a negotiation saying, we want to extend you and here's the deal we think you should sign. That's going to mean a few things. That's going to mean I'm going to put everything on the low end of what I think is a fair range, because of course this is going to be a negotiation. So I'm going to try to get away with lower stuff with the understanding that he'll probably say, no, you got to come up on some of these things. And, but this would be just a starting point, right? You probably shouldn't start with what you think is fair. Start a little bit lower than that, right? And our starting point right now is that Hockenson has 1 year left on his deal, and that is the 5th-year option. So it's a fully guaranteed $9.3 million singular 5th year that the Lions already picked up before they traded. So that's locked in. We can also get that cap hit down if we want to convert some of that to a signing bonus as part of this extension, if we decide we want to, which I'm going to because it's going to end up being pretty convenient to the contract. But I'll get more into the details of that later. For now, I am deciding that I want TJ Hockenson to be in purple through his age 31 season, or his age 30 season. Then we can go back to the negotiating table. Probably in that offseason, he'll be 30 years old, and we go, okay, how much more do we want you here for? And we'll keep ourselves a little more flexible too. I am not going to fully guarantee this deal. We probably don't have to. No tight ends are signing that. So we can give ourselves option. If he's 28 and he fell off, or if he got a bunch of injuries or something like that, we can give ourselves options and outs, even though they won't be explicitly stated in the contract. We can have moments where, okay, he doesn't have a lot of guarantees. He could be a cap casualty, and we can decide what we want to do with this, or will we restructure and add void years, do whatever, right? That is going to comprise the rest of the show. But before I get into all of it, and if you're watching on YouTube, I will pull up the contract constructor and I'll just like screen record what I'm doing so you can see. So check it out on YouTube if you aren't already checking out videos on YouTube. But if you are like a car listener or whatever, don't worry, you're not going to miss anything vital. But the visual aid should help if you have access to it. But before I get into any of that, I got to talk to you about a good old Gramble. The NBA season is right about in its midway point, and that means it's as good a time as any to jump in with FanDuel. And new customers at FanDuel get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means if your first bet doesn't win, you could get bonus bets back up to $1,000. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use, and you can bet on everything from money lines, spreads, player props, like how many threes somebody's going to get. And you can put it all together, mash it up in a same game parlay if you want to really make it spicy and get a chance at a bigger payout. But most importantly, don't miss your chance to get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/locked on. That's FanDuel.com/locked on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, if any of this stuff that I'm about to go over confuses you, if any of the words on the screen, if you can see them, are confusing to you, go check out patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. Click the video that says Let's Count Beans. That will teach you some of these terms, LTBE and NLTBE and stuff, which I'm not going to put any incentives in this contract. I think Hockenson has proven what he needs to prove. So incentives and roster bonuses and stuff. There's no injury concerns or anything like that. So there's no reason to engage with that in the contract until, he tears his ACL or something. And then we got to put incentives in because we have uncertainty. But for now, we can keep it relatively simple. So I said age 30 season. That means extending him through 2027. So I'm going to add 4 years. This will now become a 5-year contract. Now, looking around at other major tight end contracts in the league, when the money kicks in, once they hit their peak, and they all scale up differently, which is kind of dependent on that team's cap situation and plan. But when they hit their peak, they're raking in around 14.5, 15-ish million in salary per year. So for the last 3 years of the deal, I'm going to put $15 million in salary in each. Now, that might flip you out, but when it comes to percentage of the cap, this is going to land somewhere around 6% for each of these years, which is fairly standard. That's what Darren Waller's making. That's what Mark Andrews is making. And I think that that's more than fair for Hockenson. So that's going to be about going rate. And again, this is all just base salary right now. And in the last couple of years, I don't have any intention to guarantee any of it. I might guarantee some in 2025, which would be the third year of the deal, but we're not to that yet. I just want to get the basic numbers out of the way first. He, of course, makes his $9.3 million in 2023. And if he were to be franchise tagged, it would mean $18.6 million. That's the exact number actually on the screen. $18,613,784, if you're keeping track at home. Obviously, that's a pretty intense year, and I don't need that to be the case. But let's say we did franchise tag TJ Hockenson, and then we decided to, as part of a larger extension, let's say we did the thing where we tag him and then we extend him to a real deal in June, and the tag was just really a thing to buy time. So let's say that we do that. That's pretty good for TJ Hockenson. And in fact, Hawkinson's camp might want the negotiation to include as a sort of simulation of that action. So I need this. I want $18.6 million in addition to the 9.3 he already has to be fully guaranteed. And we'll just round that off and say 28 million will be fully guaranteed money here. I'm not going to do that where I put 18.6 mil in 2024. That would be a very strange flow of cash, and I don't need to do that. But just keep that in the back of your mind that by the end of the third year, let's say, he should have earned 28 million at least, and he should be very, very likely to see it. So I'm going to edit the cash flow a little bit. I'm going to make it 11.5 million in 2024, and that will now kind of accelerate in a way that I kind of like, and then I just owe an extra 7.6 million sort of off the top, which I'm going to spread out over the next 3 years of the deal. Let's say we just kind of simulate that we restructured it, and I'm not going to do it as prorated bonus or anything. I'm just going to tack it on to the salary, and to keep the numbers a little easier than that, I'll make it a 2.5. So now we're at 17.5 mil in each of the last 3 years, and that would get reported as a 4-year extension worth $64 million on the whole. That seems pretty fair, but again, we can now edit this structure a little bit to be a little more friendly. So this 9.3 mil in 2023, let's actually take a little bit. Let's just try to put some of it in signing bonus. Let's say 6 million of it, we'll say, is now in signing bonus that we can spread out. We've ostensibly cut TJ Hawkinson's cap hit for 2023 in half, while adding a measly 1.2 million to each of the other years. Now he's got 18.7 mil cap hit in each of the last 3 years of his deal, and cutting him in 2025 isn't all that bad, but is still kind of inefficient. You'd save still like 15 mil. But you would take a $3.6 million dead cap hit, and that doesn't seem great. Plus, you might end up restructuring these deals, these numbers anyways down the line if you need to make cap space in 2024. And I like having the option to do that without actually having committed to doing it. Now, what I'm going to do to ensure this is still not something that TJ Hockenson is going to say yes to. The numbers, I think, look pretty fair. But I don't think that this is secure enough for TJ Hockenson because he is like really cuttable in 2024. You could sign him to this deal, cut him next year, and then he doesn't actually see like any of the money, right? And he's not going to want to say yes to giving the Vikings the option to do that. So I need to commit to him a little bit more. So I'm going to put in a contract trigger in 2024, and I'll just type it out in this little notes section that says that the 2025 salary halfway guarantees. And I'll say that that happens on like March 1st of 2024. So kind of before free agency happens, the 2025 salary halfway guarantees. So that's going to make him a lot less cuttable. And those vested guarantees would total $8.75 million. So I'll put $8.75 million on the 2025 amount, but that stuff hasn't vested yet. And then to make sure that I have to let that contract trigger come. Now, I can trade it, and I can, if I get really desperate, I can do stuff like that. So I do leave myself the option to kind of go nuclear here, but I don't really want to make him as cuttable. So right now, if you look at what his dead cap will be next year if we cut him, on the over the cap thing, he's got big scary red numbers this year because you, of course, wouldn't sign him to a big extension, then cut him right away before the season even starts, right? But let's say he's a total catastrophe and he's a bust and we want to cut him in 2024. I don't think that's going to happen. I trust enough that that's not going to happen that I want to make it so that that is not really an option for me as a tool to get TJ Hockenson to be more likely to sign this contract where I think the numbers actually favor both sides pretty well. So if he has 4.8 mil dead and you still have a cap savings of 7.9 mil, what I want is for the dead money to be higher than the cap savings. Not so much that that the cap savings are negative. You can still have cap savings, but I want it to be so crazy inefficient. And in fact, actually, you know what? Screw it. I will guarantee so much that cutting him in 2024 is impossible. So I will fully guarantee 7.9 million of TJ Hockenson's deal. So now you have guarantees totaling almost 26 million of his 64 million total deal, or his 64 million in new money, 73 mil on the whole, and 24 of it is guaranteed. That's actually pretty low still in guarantees. And so what I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to actually vest more of that. I'm going to bump the vested up to about 10 mil in guarantees, which will take me up and over $27 million in guaranteed money. Now, again, I don't think he says yes to this. He might want a little more signing bonus. He might want a little bit more in guaranteed money. He might want a little more security out of this deal. But again, I am going to the table with this as my first offer. And if he says you got to bump up the guarantees, you got to bump this up or that up, we can sort of edit as we go. But as a starting point, I think that this is a relatively fair deal. Now, when it comes to guessing the actual numbers, a lot of what I'm doing is just copy pasting what other tight ends make. And this is actually a decent bit higher than what other tight ends make. So I actually think this is a fairly generous deal. But again, it brings down his cap hit for 2023. His cap hit for 2024 is 12.7 million. That ain't too bad. That's less than like what the franchise or the transition tag would be for us. And he still gets guarantees that kind of reflect that amount. And if you remember, if we just franchise tag him, it's like 28-ish million in guaranteed money if he just plays out this year and then next year on the tag and walks. So this guarantees most of that. And because of the way the guarantees are structured, he's really likely to just see every penny of his 2025 salary. Maybe we convert some of it into signing bonus, but he gets it either way. So he's doing better than if he gets franchise tagged. That's a really important thing about these contracts, and projecting if someone's going to say yes to it is, are you doing better than if you got franchise tagged? And I could even put, if he really needs to, I'm not going to bring it to the table, but I could even kind of copy paste that same contract trigger and put it in March of 2025 to guarantee the 2026 money. That would keep TJ Hockenson here through 2029 if the Vikings don't end up making some really efficient cuts. And I like that. I love giving the player that security and being able to keep him here and being able to keep him here on an amount that I feel okay about. I haven't added any void years. I haven't done any restructures, but you can kind of see at any moment in this contract, if I've got cap problems in 2025, he's got an $18 million cap number that can come down by like 12, 13 mil. And if I have cap problems or even more, if you want to add void years, and same deal with, 24 or 26, you can absolutely get these cap numbers down more if you decide to. But what I really wanted to use this to show you was how you can structure a deal that seems crazy, 73.3 mil for a tight end. Like, that seems totally crazy, but you can kind of structure it in a way that gives you so much flexibility and so many options down the line that if ever there comes a point where you don't feel like TJ Hockenson is worth it, there's a way out of it, whether it's post-June designations or, restructures or trading him or whatever. All of that stuff is on the table. And because I kept the signing bonus sort of small, I kept it down to $6 million and decided to use guaranteed money a little bit more to give him that sort of security. Because I kept that signing bonus small, it sort of means that I can afford to restructure this contract a little bit without killing myself with dead money. Right now, the dead money at any point cap of cutting him is not too bad unless you cut him really early. And even that is doable, just really inefficient, right? You could still post-June cut him in 2024 and save a little bit if it's just a total disaster. And that's just how you have to get rid of him. But I really don't foresee that. That's a very unlikely scenario. And I'm set up to have to do something unorthodox to get out of it if I have to, but I really am not anticipating that I have to. But 2025, 26, 27, if he needs to be a cap casualty, he can be. But again, I have no intention really of doing that because enough money will guarantee that he will, on the screen share that I've got going right now, it says that he would only come with 3.6 mil of dead money, but it would actually be 13.6 mil of dead money, and it would save you 5.1 million if you cut him in 2025 because of the way that guarantees will have already vested by the time you're making that decision. So it's sort of, okay, we can do the year 3 cut, but we're probably not going to want to. And I think that that's something you can sort of use as a negotiating chip and say, hey, you're going to see that 2025 money because this is going to suck for us. There's no way we're going to want to do it unless you totally suck. And you're TJ Hockenson. You're not going to totally suck. You've already just displayed that to us. So we're okay kind of putting this amount of trust in you. So this is the way that the contract works right now. And I feel pretty good about that. And I would kind of lock this in. But just for the sake of exploring some of the other features here, and shout out to Over the Cap for this really cool tool that kind of helps teach us how this stuff works. There are some ways that we can change this contract that are very interesting. You can have stuff like likely to be earned and not likely to be earned bonuses. Let's say that there is let's make it a ridiculous number just so it's easy to see on all the charts. A $100 million likely to be earned bonus let's move it to, let's say 2025, right? So if he's cut in 2025, you can see how the cap savings got totally ridiculous, that they're saving $115 million in cap. And if there is a not likely to be earned in 2025, that cap savings now no longer affects anywhere. You don't actually see it reflected in the transactions part of this. And for those who don't know, again, go watch the bean counting video. I think it does a better job of explaining this than I'll be able to do live. But when there is a not likely to be earned incentive, or NLBTE or NLTBE, the acronyms suck. Don't worry about the acronyms. They're very unintuitive and clunky. Essentially, it depends on what the incentive is. Like for somebody, if your incentive is to get 10 sacks, if you get 10 sacks, you get $10 million, let's say. If you got 10 sacks last year, it counts as likely to be earned because the cap sees that and says, well, you did it last year. You must be primed to do it this year. And if you didn't get 10 sacks, it counts as not likely to be earned. The difference is essentially which year you pay the money in. If it is a likely to be earned incentive, let's say I was trying to game the system and I said, I'll give you $100 million if you play one snap this year. But it's an incentive, right? So, we'll have to defer that payment till we know that you've played one snap, and we can put that money off till next year. And if I were trying to game the system that way, well, that doesn't work, right? So if you are going to do that, it has to be something that player has not done last year. And that kind of trick is something that teams use, including the Vikings and all the smart cap teams use all the time to sort of artificially defer money without that money locking in because it's still tied to an incentive. For example, let's say, or you know what, let's take like Zadarius Smith, who spent most of 2021 injured. I can essentially give him the easiest incentives ever, $3 million. They actually gave him scaling incentives that were like, if you get 3 sacks, you get this much. If you get 6 sacks, you get this much, or I forget the exact numbers, but it like scaled up, and all of them were not likely to be earned, which means none of them, even though he hit all of those incentives, none of them had to count against the cap in 2022. They all get taken out of the cap now this year, but we weren't sure that was going to happen. The world where Zadarius Smith can't stay healthy and he isn't good or he's a bust of a free agent, we wouldn't have had to pay that money. And even if we do, we're paying it a year deferred, which is there's value in, right? In being able to kind of put it off. Ask any finance person how much value there is in being able to defer debts. So that's an interesting thing. The other thing I wanted to show you on this little simulation here is what if you add void years to the end of this deal? Well, it doesn't matter because you already have 5 years. So one of the rules about prorating signing bonus is that it will either prorate over the life of the contract or for the first 5 years of the contract. So if you can't sign a 15-year contract and then have everything prorate really, really thin across all 15. It'll stop prorating after 5 years. So void years don't actually change anything. But let's say this was a 3-year extension instead. So there is something in the void year. You can actually see that the prorated bonus is now spread thinner than it would be on a 3-year extension with no void years on it. And that is kind of the way that works. And with the idea of, let's say, 2, or let's say that 1 void year, that dead cap hit in 2027 would be just 1.2 million. It would be pretty good. And you get to just shave off a clean $300K from each year. That kind of thing can add up if you do that with like a lot of contracts, and you just have to make sure that you don't get hit with too much dead money at once and that the voidings spread out. The Vikings had a pretty bad void year thing with Anthony Barr's contract last year. Now they're taking $7.5 million from Dalvin Tomlinson's contract this year. You just don't want those to happen at the same time. So I know all of that was like really granular, but I hope you kind of learned something about how all this stuff works. And I hope the idea of this is not necessarily, oh, he's kicking a lot of can down the road, or he's, jeopardizing, mortgaging the future. I'm making a purchase here with this contract, and I think the Vikings should do the same. I think they should buy into TJ Hockenson for the next 5 years. I hope that TJ Hockenson remains a Viking for a long time. I can't believe the Lions let him go for the low price of a late second-ish round pick of value. And of course, that all depends on where the teams end up, right? If the Lions are really bad next year, that means they actually gave him up for less. And if the Vikings are really good, then if the Vikings are really good, they gave him up for less or whatever. I was kind of assuming both teams were average just to keep it easy in my head. But I think Hockenson has the chance to genuinely be one of the tight ends of Viking lore that can kind of be up there with Kyle Rudolph and Steve Jordan and Stu Voigt and all those guys as, Viking tight ends that were around for a long time, that really, defined an era of football, that, we're the guy for this era of the Vikings. And I think Hockenson can kind of be the guy for this next era of the Vikings. I am very excited about the idea of him as Viking tight end for a long time. And I think the Vikings should lock into that. And if they lock into that now in this cap environment, they can sort of get away with maybe having some pretty good deals in the future. And maybe things have to accelerate a little more as the cap explodes, as gambling money goes up and becomes part of this formula as well. There's a thing in Minnesota politics right now about sports gambling. It's something to watch. Just as a Vikings fan, I don't live in Minnesota. I don't care how it goes, but um, if sports gambling is legalized in Minnesota, then that might mean something. And the professional sports teams have signed off on that bill as well, and it seems like pretty optimistic for it to pass. If that does happen, that might mean you get like bookies in the stadium. That's something the NFL has wanted to do. And if you get bookies in the stadium, that revenue will become part of the salary cap. So it will mean a higher salary cap. So if you want more salary cap, if you want the cap to keep going up so that the Vikings can keep kind of abusing that increase over and over and over again, if you want that to be the case, then you should root for this bill to pass if you don't already have some political leaning or whatever reason that you would or wouldn't want it to pass if you're a Minnesotan or if you're like me and you're watching from afar. I say go that bill because I like it when the salary cap goes up. It means we can continuously pay players more and more and more and more and not be completely suffocated for it. And I like that state of affairs. Tomorrow, I don't know what we'll talk about. Maybe I'll talk about a draft prospect or something. But we'll figure it out. FYI, I'll start saying this at the end of every show here. Monday and Tuesday next week, there will not be a show. I will be out of town, but we'll be back on Wednesday. And of course, we will have a show Thursday and Friday this week as usual. I will see you all for that. And as always, Skull.